couple of verses here that illustrate to us how the end time battle is a battle over who has control over your mind. Revelation chapter 7, verses 2 and 3. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea. This is God's seal we're talking about here. Saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of God. Where? Where does it say?
Foreheads.
In their foreheads. Seal the servants of God in their forehead. God wants to place His seal upon our forehead. This is not a rubber stamp placed on the seal on the skin of your forehead. No, this is symbolic. What does the forehead represent? Our mind, our thinking. Who has control over our thoughts? But is God the only one that wants control over our thoughts? Turn to Revelation 14. Revelation 14, verse 9. Revelation 14, verse 9. The third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast or his image, here's an opposite mark we're talking about. We were talking about God's seal earlier. Now we're talking the seal of the beast, the mark of the beast. And receive his mark, where does it say? In the forehead. Forehead or the hand. God says, I want to place a seal upon your forehead. I want to place my seal upon your mind. Satan says, I do too. And that is why the end time battle is a battle over who has control over your thinking, who has control over your mind. Turn to Romans 12. Romans 12, verse 2. Romans 12, verse 2. Paul says, be not conformed to this world. Now, when the Bible says don't do something, does the devil bring in a counterfeit? He does. He says, that's precisely what I want you to do. We're being warned against something that the devil wants. Be not conformed to this world. The devil wants conformity to the ways of the world. God says, don't be conformed to that. How do we avoid being conformed? Be ye transformed by the renewing of your, what does it say? Your mind. Exactly. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. How do we avoid conformity to worldly norms? We do it by transforming of our minds. God places His seal upon our thoughts and minds. 1 Peter 1:13, he tells us, gird up the loins of your mind. Now in the end times, in ancient times, when you gird it up, you were preparing for what? You're preparing for a battle. You're preparing to go fight something. So Peter is saying, look, in the end times, you're going to be fighting a battle. What sort of battle are you fighting? You're fighting a mental battle. Gird up the loins of your mind. The warfare in which we are engaged is largely mental, and the mind that is the most thoroughly trained will do the most acceptable work. We are not fighting a battle of swords and guns. We're fighting a battle of the mind in the end times. That is Satan's goal. It was the historian Carter G. Woodson that said, as he looked at history and the behavior of people and how leaders have had success, he said, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. Do you think the devil knows this? Absolutely he does. He'd like control over our actions, and he knows the best way to get control over our actions is to take control over our minds. How fortunate for leaders that men do not think. Who said that? Adolf Hitler. How fortunate for leaders that men do not think. Okay, so we've seen how this is absolutely critical to our success in the last days. This is absolutely critical to our spiritual life, our spiritual strength, that we have strong minds. So now we need to ask ourselves the question, what is Satan going to do to decrease thinking abilities? Because if God wants us to have thinking abilities, Satan's going to do everything he can to prevent that from happening. Now, does he wait until a child reaches the age of 18 and says, all right, on your 18th birthday, now I've given the parents a head start, and now I'm going to start damaging their thinking abilities? No, he doesn't. He waits. He starts very, very early on. We read in the book Counsels to Parents, Teachers, and Students that close reasoners and logical thinkers are few. We've already identified that, right? Less than 5%. Why? For the reason that false influences have checked the development of the intellect. Now, this word checked, we don't use it in this context very often. It means to stop, to hold back. I think about my grandpa, who's a dog trainer, and he uses something called a check lead. And it's this little rope that he'll clip on the dog's collar, and when the dog gets out of hand, he checks it. He holds it back. And so, as we look at the development of the child, we quickly realize that they are born loving to learn. They want to figure out the world around them. Those thinking abilities will develop pretty naturally. So they're progressing in these thinking abilities, they're moving along, able to think more and more and more, and then something comes in and checks it. It holds it back, it pulls it back. What is checking it? False influences. False influences. Now, there are many false influences. We could talk about quite a few of them. This morning I want to touch on 10 of them. 10 tactics to damage good thinking abilities. Tactic number 1, a lack of physical activity. Now you're saying, hang on a second, physical activity, thinking, connection there? There absolutely is a connection. Research is now telling us that for the young child, physical activity is actually more important than time spent studying. More important. So literally, if you have a section of time in the day, say you have an hour in the afternoon, and you can either do homework or go outside, you're better off going outside, getting some physical activity for the young child. Physical activity, particularly that found in outdoor work and activity, is very critical to the area of the brain known as the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a large, important area behind the brainstem, and that is linked with the higher frontal levels in the brain. So the thinking abilities are very linked with the cerebellum. It deals with the ability to perform repetitive activities automatically, with many cognitive skills, with language skills, social interaction, music, and attention. Anyone here use their cerebellum yet today? I think so. Yeah, this is a very critical area of the brain. You don't want to do without this very, very important brain area. So what is necessary for this important brain area to develop? Movement. Movement is absolutely necessary. The cerebellum cannot develop properly without sufficient movement. Things like rocking for the infant help develop the cerebellum. Crawling for the toddler not only helps the cerebellum, it helps build the corpus callosum, which is the connection between the hemispheres of the brain, and helps develop the whole brain thinking skills. Spinning, hanging upside down. We wonder why children like to do those things and adults can't stand it. It's actually good for their brains, and we now know that it doesn't stimulate the vestibular system in quite the same way in childhood, so children actually don't get as dizzy as adults because God knew it was good for their brain. Dr. Jane Healy, she has a PhD in educational psychology. She's written many books, one of the eminent educational psychologists of our day. You'll see a few quotes from her. She tells us that after birth, physical activities are one of the child's main means of advancing physical, intellectual, and emotional growth. So you should encourage many forms of body movement. Those are 3 very important areas of growth: physical, intellectual, emotional. We don't want to do without those, and we see that she's telling us we should have many forms of body movement. These help those areas grow and develop. Now, there are lots of ways to get exercise and physical activity. Now, the best form of physical activity is found outside. Outdoor activity is always best. And there are lots of things you could do outside, many of them very good: walking, swimming, running, whatever. But what if you had to pick one outdoor activity that was better than all the rest? What would it be? Any guesses here?
Horse riding.
What is it?
Horse riding.
Horse riding. That's a good one, but not quite. How about gardening?
Oh, yes.
No line of manual training is of more value than agriculture. Agriculture is absolutely a blessing. Why? Why agriculture? I mean, why not something else? Why not horse riding? Well, there's a lot of benefits to gardening that we are still trying to discover. They have found that children who are involved in gardening are more self-confident, they have better self-esteem, more patient, more persevering, have improved science understanding, better test scores, and were overall better learners, simply from being in the garden. The experimental group of gardening students outperformed the control group of non-gardening students in all areas: general information, reading recognition, reading comprehension, total reading, mathematics, spelling, and written language. What do any of these things have to do with gardening? Nothing, evidently, but somehow this process of gardening was helping them in these other areas too. Now, as far as getting better test scores and becoming better learners, they're still not quite sure why, but they think they found some small clues, microscopic clues, known as Mycobacterium voccae. This mycobacterium, we have good bacteria, we have bad bacteria. This is a very good bacteria, and it has been found to reduce depression, to improve lung health, to boost the immune system, to fight cancer, strengthen the digestive system, treat arthritis, improve emotional and mental health, lower stress and anxiety, reduce allergies, and to top it off, make you smarter, improve IQ. Who wants some of the Mycobacterium voccae? I think we all do. Now, I had somebody ask me recently, can I get that in the health food store in a capsule form? Unfortunately, no. Where do you get this important bacteria? From the dirt. It comes from the soil in which your gardens grow. In one study, they fed it to mice and found that those mice that did not ingest the bacterium, compared to those mice that did not ingest the bacterium, the voccoe mice navigated a maze twice as fast and exhibited half of the anxiety behaviors. So it made them smarter and it made them less stressed. This is a pretty powerful bacteria. So, evidently getting dirty actually makes you smarter. So next time your kid comes in covered with mud, just think about how much smarter they are instead of the laundry you have to do. Now, in addition to making us smarter, they have found that they actually boost our immune system, this bacteria. It can actually make us healthier. Studies have shown that children who live on farms and in rural areas typically has less than half the incidence of allergies and asthma compared to those who are living in urban areas or in the city. Which is rather ironic, because what do we usually associate with allergies and asthma? Well, it's the dirt and dust you find outside, right? Well, what they're finding is that as you're exposed to it from an early age, your body builds up an immune response, very much in part linked to this important bacteria, Mycobacterium voccae. These data support the idea that the greater diversity of microbial exposure among children who live on farms is associated with protection from the development of asthma. These studies help us understand how the body communicates with the brain and why a healthy immune system is important for maintaining mental health. They also leave us, according to a scientist here, wondering if we shouldn't all be spending more time playing in the dirt. We read that the Garden of Eden was not only Adam's dwelling, but his schoolroom. There are so many great things you can learn in the garden. You can learn science, you can learn math, you can learn communication as you're working together and get some benefits from this bacteria. But there's more to it than that. Where did God place Adam at the beginning of time? He put him in the garden. Was that a mistake? Did God just change his mind later? No, I think this was intentional. God knew this was the ideal environment for Adam to learn in. What was he learning? Not just practical things about how to grow a garden. He was walking and talking with God. As he communed with God in nature, as he was interacting with him through God's creation, he learned of God and his character. Okay, that's enough on the physical activity. Now we have point number 2, and that is overstimulation. Overstimulation can take many forms. I'll start with toys. We see kids just piled on with so many toys and things to do, activities, things to keep them busy. They actually find that the more toys children have, the more bored they are. The more toys, the more bored. Process that one for a moment. It's actually creating a response in the brain of superficial thinking. They always have something to jump to, always have something to move on to, so there's no need to focus for a longer period of time. Electronic devices are very overstimulating. I'll get to that in a few minutes. And also just this multitude of activities. We see, school and more homework and, music lessons and swimming and this, that, and the other. We're just piling kids on with so much in the day-to-day life, and it's not healthful for learning. It's been linked to the stress response in the mind, the danger response. Children literally feel afraid in an overstimulated environment. Overactivity, frustration, irritability, and superficial thinking. Children need time to process things, to just learn through exploration. And this environment we have of piling or of quickly switching from one subject to another in the classroom. We have math, and now stop that, now for English, now stop that, time for history. And that's really disconnecting in the minds of children, and that is another form of overstimulation. Elizabeth Walling put it well. She said the bell will ring just when they're engulfed in learning about the solar system to tell them it's time to start learning how to dissect a sentence. A child learns that no subject is truly meaningful or interesting, and therefore learns not to be truly interested in anything meaningful. I'm sure we've all experienced this. We sort of lose interest in education because it's just not very connected to real life. Children need time to think and to explore, to figure out the world around them. And the great part about exploration is that it gives many opportunities for what's known as incidental learning. Incidental learning, where you learn something in everyday life without really sitting down and having an official learning time. Dr. Healy had a great example in her book, Your Child's Growing Mind, and says another youngster was busy constructing some mental schemas about number. He lined up 8 blocks in a row and counted them in one direction, then backward to see if they were the same. Then he stacked them up into a tower and counted them again, up and down. Convinced that 8 must be 8 from all directions, he skipped off, unaware he had just mastered an abstract mathematical idea. Here was a great everyday learning experience. Now, what would have happened if somebody had stopped him in the middle of this and gone off to do some homework? He may have been learning something else through the homework, but he was learning something very well through this experience too. So be intentional. Look for those incidental learning opportunities. It was Dr. Raymond Moore who, one of the greatest researchers on education of the past century, as he put, quietness, calmness, and freedom from artificial excitement build strength in the immature child. The more quiet and simple the life of the child, the more free from artificial excitement and the more in harmony with nature, the more favorable it is to physical and mental vigor and spiritual strength. Free from artificial excitement, in harmony with nature. Point number 2, too much study. Too much study. Can we have too much of a good thing? Yeah, study's good. We need to study, but we can have too much of it too. And too much study has been linked to learned helplessness, to shutting off, to superficial learning, burnout, illnesses, many learning disabilities. We're just trying to cram too much into the minds of students, and we're creating a lot of problems through this environment. Point number 4, testing. Testing is a really, really big problem today. Standardized testing gets a lot of attention, and I would agree, our standardized testing environment is not helping children learn. But I'd like to propose that this whole idea that we have to somehow measure children through a test, be that standardized or otherwise, and just, we're so obsessed now with putting labels on kids and identifying exactly how they're doing, that's not helping them learn, and it's also damaging good thinking skills. Dr. David Elkin comes to us with a PhD in child development from Tufts University. He wrote a great book called The Hurried Child. He tells us that schools have become increasingly industrialized and product-oriented. Teachers are unionized, textbooks are standardized on a national level, and testing has become mechanized and all-pervasive as a consequence. Education is reforming, which means more basics, more hours, more homework, more testing, more of everything that's creating the problem. It's a classic case of the cure being worse than the disease. That's a great point he's making here. All these things that are supposedly supposed to be helping our children, what if they're actually doing more harm than good? What if they're actually creating a lot of the problems that we're seeing? The factory model of education hurries children because it ignores individual differences in mental abilities and learning rates and learning styles. Children are pressured to meet uniform standards as measured by standardized tests. Those who cannot keep up in this system, as indicated by the test, are often regarded as defective vessels and are labeled learning disabled or ADHD. That's a sad system. We don't want to put our children through this environment. The thing to remember, the point to take home out of this testing situation is that under these circumstances, children discover very quickly that passing tests rather than meaningful learning is what school is all about. I'm sure we can all relate to this. I think to my college years, and it was cramming the night before, remembering as many facts as I could. The next morning I'd take the test, and an hour later I didn't remember anything I'd put down. Maybe, slight exaggeration there, but that's the environment that we're putting kids through. We're teaching them that it's all about passing tests. It's all about just remembering facts long enough to write them down, and we're not teaching them good, meaningful learning. There's no time or space to develop deep understanding of concepts, to test out new ideas through verbal and written action, or develop deductive reasoning skills. The memorizing necessary for these tests is a linear process that does not require entire brain use. Rote memory is a straight line process that requires none of the depth of understanding that comes from whole brain activation. In short, rote memory does not require thinking. Look, if we're trying to encourage good thinking skills, it seems this rote memory process isn't encouraging that. It's actually harmful. Now, I do want to clarify, there is a difference between memorizing something because you've learned it well. It's a great experience you've had in life, and so you remember it well. And there's also a difference between rote memory and memorizing something with meaning. Take scripture memorization. You're thinking about it. You're memorizing with the understanding of it. Very different from rote memory, where you're just learning facts long enough to put them down on a test. Doris Fromberg, who's the director of early childhood teacher education at Hofstra University, tells us that standardized tests are categorizing children, and she tells us there is no evidence that it makes a difference in learning. Look, they have enough research by now. We've been testing for long enough. We should be able to know whether it's helping or not, and it's not. There is no evidence that it makes a difference in learning. So who's benefiting? Why are they still doing it? She tells us it's large corporations and publishing companies. That makes sense. Those are the ones benefiting because they have to produce the curriculum that are then, you have the test, then they're testing according to the curriculum. I didn't say that. This is the researcher saying those are the only people benefiting. It's not the children. Now, another major problem with testing is this whole concept. We sort of are assuming through this testing process that all children are going to somehow learn alike. Now, how many of you have more than one child? All right. So in the morning, you're in the kitchen and one of the children comes up and you're like, oh, wait a second. Now, which one is this? We're going to have to come up with a numbering system. Does that work? No, I mean, that doesn't happen. Why? Because every child is different. God has designed every child to be vastly different, to learn differently, to have different ideas, to be an individual, to have great diversity. So what gets into us to think that we can have an educational system that's one size fits all? Education can't be one size fits all because there is no one size fits all when it comes to how children learn. There's a great parable about this called the animal school. Just process this diagram for a moment. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Now, out of these animals, which one is going to be okay with this? Well, the monkey. The rest of them are pretty unhappy about this test, right? It's not fair at all. You see, once upon a time, the animals decided they needed to do something to meet the problems of the new world, so they organized a school. They adopted an activity curriculum that consisted of running, of climbing, of swimming, and of flying. Now, to make it easier to administer the curriculum, all the animals just took all the subjects. They were all highly motivated. They wanted to learn. They wanted to get good grades, so they all tried very hard. Well, to start with, we had a duck. And this duck, he was excellent in swimming. He was great in flying. In fact, he was better at flying than his instructor. But he lagged behind his classmates in running and climbing, so he had to stay after school and also drop swimming in order to practice these two subjects. Soon his webbed feet were badly worn from running, that he was only average in swimming. But average was acceptable in school, so nobody worried about that except the duck. Next up, we have the squirrel. Now, the squirrel's an animal we have in the U.S. I've learned you don't have it here in Australia, but excuse me. It's a furry little creature about this big that climbs trees, highly energetic, runs around a lot, quite pesty sometimes. So this squirrel, he was first in his class in climbing and running. That's what he was made for. He was great at it. And he was second only to the duck at flying. But the difference in the flying class is he developed some pretty serious frustration issues because his teacher made him start from the ground up. And he wanted to start from the tree top and go down. He developed Charlie horses from overexertion and caught pneumonia in swimming class, so he missed so much school that he got a C in climbing and a D in running. To make matters worse, because the squirrel constantly squirmed and chattered in class, he was diagnosed with a learning disorder and had to be placed in remedial classes and medicated in order to continue his schoolwork. We had a rabbit also, and he started at the top of his class in running, but had a nervous breakdown because of so much makeup work in swimming. The fox was a natural in his running class and scored fairly well in climbing and in swimming, but became so frustrated at his inability to get good grades at flying that he began assaulting his classmates. He even tried to eat the duck. His behavior became pretty bad. He wound up in a center for animal delinquents and was expelled from school. The eagle was a problem child and disciplined severely. In the climbing class, he beat all the others to the top of the tree, but he insisted on using his own way to get there. The elephant, meanwhile, developed low self-esteem because he couldn't do well in any of the subjects. When he sank into clinical depression, his therapist persuaded him to try a different school that focused on subjects such as lifting and carrying. Well, the elephant was disappointed because careers in lifting and carrying weren't as prestigious as careers in running, climbing, swimming, or flying. Even though he always felt inferior, he managed to make a decent living and support his family. Well, at the end of the year, an abnormal eel, and this eel could swim very well. He could also run, climb, and fly just a little bit. Well, he had the highest average because he could do a little bit of each one and was valedictorian of the class. The prairie dogs, they're another U.S. little mammal we have that dig burrows and they live underground. They stayed out of school and fought the tax levy because the administration would not add digging and burrowing to the curriculum. They apprenticed their children to a badger and later joined the groundhogs and gophers to start a successful private school. Now, we laugh at the ridiculousness of the parable. Obviously, no such thing ever happened. But can you see the serious side behind this? You know, really, what is getting into us to think that we can take children who are as diverse as the animals, they have various skills and various talents that God has placed in them. Why do we think we can put them through the same system and same testing environment that treats them as if education was a one-size-fits-all? Point number 5, poor health and nutrition. We could spend a lot of time on this, but what we eat has a profound impact upon our minds, particularly so in early childhood. As the brain is developing, it really needs proper nutrition. I'll mention just a couple of quick points along these lines. It's now believed that myelin, which is an essential component for brain development at an early age, is made primarily out of essential fatty acids, which are particularly those found in breast milk. Breast is absolutely best for the infants. They also did a study of 1 million students in New York. That's a huge study. And they took a group of them and took out any food that had artificial flavors, preservatives, and dyes. And they found that those students did 14% better on IQ tests. 14% is a significant jump. We also know that sugar impacts the developing mind in very harmful ways. Satan knows. He's had his hand in designing the poor diet we see in youngsters today because he knows if they don't get the nutrition they need, they'll have a much smaller chance of developing good thinking abilities. Point number 6, age segregation. Age segregation, this whole idea that we have to put children with other children of their same age for proper learning and socialization, that is a myth and a relatively recent phenomenon, actually. The placement of children in separate classes with others of the same age is a fairly recent phenomenon. Age segregation did not occur in full force until the 1930s when the advent of compulsory education laws brought a large influx of children to the public school system. So the 1930s date, that's a U.S. date, but the point is not the date. The point is the concept here. We have compulsory education laws that come in, and you have all these children that have to be organized somehow. How do you organize them? Well, you cut them up by age. Until then, the main source of formal education for most children was the one-room schoolhouse, which on average contained approximately 25 children ranging in age from 5 to 15. They've studied the one-room schoolhouse quite a bit and have found some considerable advantages to that, actually. Never in history until the 20th century have young people been largely separated from the ongoing and productive activities of society. That's the important point to remember here. We're pulling children away from real life. We're separating them from what it means to be a functional adult when we are segregating them by age. Society's survival depends on raising new generations in close proximity with adults who are engaged in their central roles. Institutional age segregation creates a situation in which parents' productive work, indeed major portions of their adult lives, are carried out in settings where there are no children. Children do not get to know a variety of adults and observe their lives. We need to ask ourselves the question, though. We are preparing children for real life, so is real life age segregated? No. No, definitely not age segregated. As Dan Greenberg, who founded an age-integrated school, puts sort of tongue-in-cheek, he says, does such division take place naturally anywhere? In industry, do all 21-year-old laborers work separately from 20-year-olds or 23-year-olds? In business, are there separate rooms for 30-year-old executives and 31-year-old executives? Obviously not. So where on earth was this idea conceived? Is anything more socially damaging than segregating children by year for 14 or often 18 years? Socially damaging. Notice what he's bringing out there, because what's the common argument? Why do we segregate children? Well, they say it's important for proper socialization. And he's telling us that it's actually damaging to good socialization. The Russian developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, you may have come across that name if you studied psychology in college, he developed a concept known as the zone of proximal development. This is defined as tasks that a child can accomplish only with some assistance and support. Most cognitive development takes place in this zone of proximal development, and children develop primarily by attempting tasks they can accomplish only in collaboration with a more competent individual. This is a rather complicated way of saying this. So let's hear just a simple example. Suppose we have two 3-year-olds here, Anyone ever seen two 3-year-olds playing a game of catch with a ball? Probably not. Or if you did, it didn't last very long, right? Now suppose, neither one of them are coordinated well enough, and so the game just dissolves. Now suppose we have a 3-year-old and a 10-year-old. Does the game of catch become more possible? Absolutely it does, because the 10-year-old can throw that ball into the outstretched arms of the 3-year-old, and then when the 3-year-old makes some crazy throw back, the 10-year-old can jump around and catch it. So that game of catch became within the zone of proximal development. It was a task that this 3-year-old could accomplish only with the assistance and support of the 10-year-old. And therefore, that's why the learning took place within this zone, and that's why children develop primarily by the interaction and the collaboration with more competent individuals. Notice they need interaction. It's not just sitting there absorbing from a more competent individual, because it could be argued, I suppose, that you have the zone of proximal development as a child sitting there in the classroom. Not so much. You don't have the interactive collaboration. It's more just sitting and absorbing. Education and research has found advantages in age-integrated schools. Better academics. Children actually perform better academically in age-integrated schools. They have better self-esteem. You don't have the peer influence where people are sort of cutting each other down, among many other reasons why self-esteem would be better. And get this one, socialization skills. Socialization skills. It's often argued, don't children have to be with other kids the same age for proper socialization? According to the research, no, that's a myth. Children actually need a wide range of social activities and experiences for proper socialization. We have to ask ourselves the question, are we training children to be children or to be adults? If we're wanting to prepare them for adulthood, then we need to consider the fact that children don't learn how to be adults from other children. They learn how to be adults from other adults. And so if we're really wanting to prepare them for adulthood, they need the full range of interaction with many ages. Obviously, nothing wrong with children playing together, with them having a great time with others their same age. But if we're just looking at the principle of socialization, they actually will develop better socialization with a wider range of ages. The results seem to show that a child's social development depends more on adult contact and less on contact with other children as previously thought. And it improves learning abilities too. When you're little and just with kids your own age, the range of possible activities is restricted by the knowledge and abilities of those in your age group. But in collaboration with older kids, there's almost no limit to what you might do. And as John Taylor Gatto put it so well, a close study of what big people were up to was always the most exciting occupation of youth. Isn't that the way it used to be? You couldn't wait to go see what the big people were up to. That was the most exciting thing that a child could do, is find out what the other grown-ups were doing. And we sort of lost that in the age-segregated, media-saturated culture that we have now. Children are compared to everyone else of the same age, and they're not encouraged to rise to a higher thinking level because they're spending the majority of their lives with those who are at the same level they are, more or less. That's a generalization, obviously, but we're not encouraging them to those higher thinking levels. Cooperation should be the spirit of the schoolroom, the law of its life. Let the older assist the younger, the strong the weak, and so far as possible, let each be called upon to do something in which he excels. This will encourage self-respect and a desire to be useful. Let the older assist the younger, the strong the weak, that principle of unselfish service for others. That's the ideal environment in the schoolroom. Now, age segregation is not just impacting schools. We have to consider its impacts in the church too. We have very age-segregated programs in church. And is it really paying off? Are we seeing benefits from that? No, it's really not. There's a great documentary that's been produced called Divided. I want to show just a clip of that right now. You can get that in the resources in the back, and then also you can get it on my website at athinkinggeneration.org.
The ministry that I'm serving at currently has been in existence for 25 years. The percentage of young people that have come through the youth ministry there over time and are currently attending after high school is 0.
Two-thirds of young people are going to leave the church. I mean, that's a shocking statistic.
We have failed to reach the next generation. It's time to get past the denial phase.
The house of God has been torn down. The walls are rubble. The gates of the city are ripped off its hinges. And it's a time of emergency.
My name's Philip Leclerc. I'm on a journey to find out how we've failed to reach the next generation within the church. I'm not an expert or a theologian. I'm a filmmaker, documenting what is believed to be one of the biggest problems facing the American church today. Along the journey, I'll be meeting with leaders in theology and youth ministry, asking what I believe to be some simple yet critical questions facing this generation.
Every generation in the history of the church has had its defining issue. In our generation, the issue that's facing the church is whether parents will be able to raise up a new generation for the future.
Where do we get our model for youth ministry? Does the Word of God give us direction for how to minister to the youth? Is age-segregated youth ministry biblical?
The origin of the great crisis of our present day between parents and children, between the church and the family, is rooted in compromise, a deviation from Scripture.
The truth is, there's not a shred of evidence from Genesis to Revelation that age-segregated programmatic youth ministry ever existed.
I've seen it. I've seen the products of the most highly touted youth ministries in America. But nowhere have I seen the kind of fruit that's being produced in churches that are functioning biblically and calling families to function biblically.
Highly recommend that documentary. All right, point number 7, television and electronics. TV and electronics. This is the big one. You know, when I talk to people, I talk about damages to thinking skills. They always bring this one up. You know, it's the TV and electronics. That's the one that's doing the most damage. It is doing a lot of damage. There's a lot of other thought-damaging areas also, but this is doing a major amount of damage. There are two sort of paths we could take in this media discussion. We could focus on content. There's a lot of attention that's been given to the dangers of bad content in media. Obviously, that's not something, I think as a Christian parent, we sort of intuitively know that you don't want to put children in front of bad content media. We have to consider it's not just bad content, but any untrue content also, because we realize that the thinking centers of the brain begin to shut off as we are involved in most media. So I think it's about 30 seconds of watching television that the frontal lobe is completely shut off, and you are now in a state of absorbing whatever is dished out to you. You're not thinking through what you're viewing. So take that very seriously. But content aside, let's think of just media itself. So just, you know, even good content media, educational media. Is it as good as we think it is, or are there some problems with it? We are finding that television and electronics are terribly damaging to the developing mind. The major reason for this is that TV and electronics are starving children of essential brain development. They need time to physically interact with the real world around them, and sitting there with the screen is not giving them that time. It's very harmful for development. Dr. Healy points out that much early development of physical and mental skills and their foundations in the brain comes from experimenting and solving problems with what kind of materials? Real-world materials. The long-term outcomes of forcing children's attention unnaturally may have even more serious implications than we have realized. Notice she's saying it's forcing their attention. Tuck that little thought in your mind. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But she's also telling us that we're separating them from real life. They're not getting real-world interaction. She has a list of 8 problems with electronics and television. First of all, she tells us it overstimulates children. We've already seen overstimulation is a problem, and it also creates what's known as passive withdrawal. Passive withdrawal is where areas of the brain, neurons in the brain, begin to shut down. They sort of reach a passive state. They're not actively engaged in the thinking process. It causes attention and listening problems. We see the rise of ADHD, or the incidence of ADHD, directly parallel often to the use of electronics and other media and television viewing. It emphasizes skills which do not transfer well to reading or listening. It requires less mental effort than reading. Look, all of us know that sitting in front of the TV is far easier than sitting down and opening for a Bible study. You know, so do we want to encourage our children to love to study God's Word, to love to study, the academics even? Of course we do. And so the TV viewing is not helping them with that. It also shortens the time children are willing to spend on finding an answer to intellectual problems that they are set to solve. We are decreasing problem-solving abilities. It artificially manipulates the brain into paying attention by violating certain of its natural defenses with frequent visual and auditory changes. This is known as saliency. Let's unpack this a bit. Sudden close-ups, pans, and zooms are effective in alerting the brain because they violate its reflex need to maintain a predictable personal space. Salient features such as bright colors, quick movements, or sudden noises get attention fast, since brains are programmed to be extremely sensitive to such changes that might signal danger. Look, we're hardwired this way. Anything that moves will catch our attention. And just look at any television. Close-ups, pans, zooms, bright colors, quick movements, sudden noises, everything in this, that's just part and parcel of how television works. Any movie, even documentaries, good documentaries, this is just how they're done. And we're hardwired to catch these things. The brain is wired to register these quick movements. So what happens? Well, in a sense, these carefully planned manipulations separate the natural responses of brain and body. Although the viewer's attention is alerted, there's no need for the physical action. The brain registers specific changes after a camera zoom, for example, responding as if to real danger, yet the impulse has no outlet. Separating the natural response of brain and body. It's like this. Suppose you're on a safari. You've gone to Africa, and you're going to enjoy seeing some beautiful wildlife. And so you're bumping along for a while in your safari vehicle, and you decide you're tired of riding. You're moving pretty slowly anyway. So you decide to get out and stretch your legs a bit and take a walk. So you're out enjoying the stroll, looking at the beautiful scenery around you, and you look in the bush, and right over there is a lion. A little movement caught your attention, So you're looking, like, wow, that's a lion. That's pretty cool. And then it steps out a bit, and it crouches, and its tail twitches, and it roars, and he's looking right at you. Now, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it, John? Run. Yeah, exactly. You're going to run. You're going to run pretty fast. You're going to hope you can run faster than that lion. You're going to get back to that vehicle as quick as you can. That's the natural response of brain and body. Your brain says, that's scary. Get me out of here and make it quick. Now, if you're sitting there viewing the television, you might not think something is scary, but your brain says that's scary. You better do something about it, but you don't do anything about it. You actually just sit there, and so we've separated the natural response of brain and body. Particularly harmful for adults, but it's really harmful for children because the young mind is developing. It's trying to figure out the world around them to see how it works, and we're disconnecting the brain, and it's very harmful to the developing mind. And, again, it's not just television. We see this in many other forms of media. You can take a toddler, give them an iPad, and they'll open up an app. And if you watch their eyes, a lot of times, more often than not, you'll see a little flinch. And that's the startle response as the brain is saying, whoa, that's dangerous. But the baby's not doing anything about it. They're just sitting there. Point number 7, it induces neural passivity. What is neural passivity? What's neural referring to? The brain, right. Passivity? Well, kind of doing nothing, right? So the brain doing nothing induces the brain to do nothing, and it reduces the brain's ability to remain actively focused on a task. And lastly, most importantly, TV has a hypnotic and possibly neurologically addictive. Now, she says possibly neurologically addictive. This book was written about 10 years ago. They now know beyond the shadow of a doubt it is neurologically addictive. Has an effect on the brain that changes the frequency of its electrical impulses in ways that block active mental processing. Okay, let's unpack a few things in this. Hypnotic. Give me a definition of hypnosis. Hypnosis. Well, it's sort of like being forced to do something, or maybe absorbing something even though you don't realize it. You reach a state where you'll absorb whatever you're given. They did an experiment with a gentleman who was a weightlifter, and they sat him down at a table and hypnotized him. And they had a glass of water sitting there, and while he was in this state of hypnosis, they told him that he could not pick up this glass of water. They then brought him out of hypnosis, just a normal person like you and I, except he was very strong. And they said, "Sir, can you hand me that glass of water?" He reached over, and he couldn't pick up the glass of water. His muscles were bulging. Sweat is pouring down his face as he's attempting to lift up this simple glass of water. Why? That is how powerful hypnosis is. You reach this state, and your brain believes exactly what it's told. And that's of particular concern. You sit there absorbing media, you reach a state of hypnosis, which only takes less than 30 seconds, and you will absorb whatever you're given as absolute truth. It goes into your brain whether you want it to or not. And then she also says neurologically addictive. You know, what are symptoms of addiction? Well, you can't do without it, and you always want more. And you take most young people and tell them you're going to take their electronics away, they're going to have a meltdown. Why? Because they are addicted to it. We absolutely know they're addictive. There's no question about that. It is very, very harmful. It changes the frequency of its electrical impulses in ways that block active mental processing. We're damaging mental processing skills. We are hurting thinking skills. Now, it's not just television, though. You know, the iPads and the iPods and all the screens, the electronics in general are very harmful. The thing to remember is that research is often very slow in coming. So the electronics come out, and then a few years later, the research comes out and says, "Oh, by the way, that stuff is bad for you." You know, a little late by that point, right? For example, the American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended for years absolutely no screen time until the age of 2. They changed that a bit later. Well, I think it was a different research group actually that changed it a bit later and said, you know, based on the research, it's looking more like age 7 is going to be the best age to eliminate screens before they reach the age of 7, based on the development of the brain and the damages we're finding with electronics. A bit later, they changed that. And they said, look, we're finding a lot more problems with it. And based on the development of the brain, it's going to be more like age 8 before you want to introduce any screens. Then at the beginning of 2015, another group came out, or it was a researcher, and she argued that children should not have any electronics until the age of 12, based on the research. She gave some very good evidence for that. So, again, the research is slow in coming. It's not as well funded as the electronics companies, so we have to realize that we better play it safe. You know, look, when the research comes out, it's not usually, in fact, almost never does it point toward an improvement or something good about electronics. It's only bringing out damages. So let's get ahead of the game and limit it as much as possible. Now, I hear from moms often, they say, now hang on a second, you're taking away the best babysitter I have. There's nothing that keeps my child's attention like my iPad. Well, and I say you're absolutely right. We just read. It's neurologically addictive. It's hypnotic. Dr. Haley says it forces their attention. You know, it does hold their attention. There's no questioning that, but we have to consider what are the implications of it holding their attention. When they need the real world interaction, you know, the best babysitter is to send them outside. Let them get a little dirty. Let them play around outside. That's what's good for them. They've also done some studies on adults, and they found that adults who read out of an e-book reader or the smartphone or a screen compared to those who read out of a textbook or, you know, the physical page, those who read it out of a page remember and retain and comprehend far more than those who read it off of the screen. They also do studies on people taking notes. Those who write it down pencil and paper, old-fashioned style, remember better than the ones who can write it down electronically, even though many of the electronic note takers can write down twice as much because they're faster than writing it down pencil and paper. The ones that did pencil and paper did better. So let's just go back to old-fashioned, shall we? You know, I mean, obviously media is a part of our life. We need to include that, but we could go back to more natural ways of doing it. And that's exactly, we read this earlier, the more quiet and simple the life of the child, the more free from artificial excitement and the more in harmony with nature, the more favorable it is to physical and mental vigor and spiritual strength. That's the ideal environment, in harmony with nature, free from artificial excitement. There's another great documentary, it's called Captivated. And this documentary takes a look at the impact of media on children and on families, and it's encouraging them to go back a bit to that natural lifestyle and consider the impact. This looks at media use, and it talks to some of the top scientists from around the U.S. in particular. Some excellent research to the table. I want to show just a clip of that real quick.
We live in a media-saturated society.
The screen time for the average American child is over 53 hours a week.
The digital age has swept into young adults' lives like a tidal wave.
Media has taken my generation captive.
Media was very big in helping me to escape the realities of my life.
I was captivated by television. It dictated what I was going to do and when I was going to do it.
It's a bigger addiction than drugs a lot of times.
There is a great need for concern.
Have we entered a techno-utopia or a virtual prison?
Pretty much my life consisted of media in some way, shape, or form.
I just got so sucked up in it, it just kind of took over part of my life.
Is our social experience richer and deeper, or more shallow and artificial?
I was on Facebook every day, all day long.
We stand a chance of roboticizing relationships.
The trivia of youth are amplified by these digital tools.
Men are trying to escape into the world of games. We've arranged the culture to trick their brains into thinking that they've done something when in fact they haven't.
You can't think, I'll watch and I'll listen, but I won't do.
Is there hope of finding freedom?
I found that there's more of a freedom without media, in all honesty.
When I was able to let go, there was such incredible freedom.
This world would be a completely different place if we weren't all glued to a screen.
There's a need to break free from these chains that bind us.
When you unplug, all of these things that are part of God's design for us begin to be restored.
All right, and you can also get that on my website at athinkinggeneration.org. Next up, we have iChild. This is currently on pre-order. This is a documentary, not a documentary, but a lecture series that I'm putting together, 3 parts, on how electronics are programming our children's brains. This will really focus in on early childhood. What is the research really showing about early childhood? Ask the questions about educational media. Is it really backed up by the research? How's educational media doing? Those questions will be answered in this DVD. 2 more points we'll make. Point number 8, an education chiefly of the mind. An education chiefly of the mind. It's rather ironic. It's an ironic reality that an education which is just focusing on the memory skills and the linear thinking and the sit-down academics, soon causes the brain to lose that capability for whole brain problem solving, because good thinking skills, problem solving, requires the whole brain. Imagine, just a moment, you're sitting down, you're trying to figure something out. Well, if your brain's working well, you're going to have the right hemisphere hard at work coming up with creative solutions, imagining, processing the whole picture, providing intuition and insight. The left hemisphere, it's analyzing the situation, looking at the details, crunching notes, taking notes, using logic. The frontal lobe is helping your brain concentrate, controlling your movement, your mood, your behavior, aiding you in that final decision-making process. Broca's area is controlling speech. The occipital lobe is controlling visual perception. The temporal lobe is controlling hearing, language, memory. Every area of your brain has its function, and they all are interconnected together. The whole brain is used for critical thinking. Suppose, let's take another analogy. Suppose I wanted to get some bigger arm muscles, so I decided to go to the gym and start working out. Now, as I'm on my way to the gym, I think, I'm a very right-hand dominant person. My left arm's plenty strong enough as is, so I'm not going to go through the effort to work out on my right arm, my left arm. I'm just going to work my right arm. So I put my left arm in a pocket, and I carry on my life. 2 months goes by, and every day I'm lifting weights with my right arm. At the end of 2 months, what's this situation going to look like? Not so good, right? Yeah, I'm lopsided. This side's going to be smaller than this side, and this side is going to be sort of receding a bit into the background. It's going to atrophy if I'm not using it any. And that's the same exact thing if we think about the brain as a muscle. If we're only working one area of the brain, we're going to cause the other areas to get weaker. And that's precisely what we're doing. Education needs to have 3 parts. It needs to have harmonious development, an equal development of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual, or the moral, the character development. So the problem is, too often we're just focusing on mental, as if that's the most important thing. It's important, but it's only one of 3. We can't just have one out of the 3. We need all 3, the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. An education derived chiefly from books leads to superficial thinking. Nothing wrong with books, right? But if that's all we're getting our education from, it leads to superficial thinking. Practical work encourages close observation and independent thought. Rightly performed, it tends to develop that practical wisdom which we call common sense, all too uncommon these days. It develops the ability to plan and execute, strengthens courage and perseverance, and calls for the exercise of tact and skill. Point number 9, a lack of training to think. So not only have we seen some damages, some false influences that are holding back the development of the intellect, but we also need to consider that children sometimes need some encouragement to think. How can we help them do this? Simply allow them to figure things out for themselves. Don't micromanage and hover around how they do things. Be there for them, be supportive for them, of course, but allow them to figure things out for themselves. Encourage them to figure things out for themselves. Let them learn by exploring the world around them, and of course, allow them to make some minor mistakes. I think this is harder for parents usually than children. Children are fine with making some mistakes. They scrape their knee, they cry a bit, and they carry on with their day, But children are just not getting much of a chance to experience childhood now. We live in such a sterile environment often that we're not even giving them a chance to just go outside, play, run around, and get hurt a little bit, scratch themselves. A little cut, a nick here and there is good learning experience. They learn what they're capable of. They learn what to do, what not to do, and they learn to make decisions. Making decisions is absolutely key. And it's the practical everyday that teaches us how to make decisions, because we can physically experience it. You don't get as much of this feedback if you're just sitting there watching media or sitting there watching, in the classroom. They need physical interaction with their everyday life, making some minor mistakes. And as they do this, as they learn to reason from cause to effect, as they learn to process their decisions, they can apply this then into the spiritual realm. Okay, we have seen a lack of physical activity, overstimulation, too much study, testing, poor health and nutrition, age segregation, television and electronics, and education chiefly of the mind, a lack of training to think, and now tactic number 10. This is Satan's biggest tactic. It causes an inability to think formally, a disorganization of the brain, learned helplessness, learning disabilities, eye problems, school burnout, school dropout, a lack of spirituality, a major cause of our young people leaving the church, and a major cause of a lack of a thinking generation. This is a master tactic of Satan. What is it? Well, you have to come back after the break. The position of a parent. I want to end with this quotation. I want to look at this because we have to realize that it's easy to take a look at these tactics that we've just discussed and point fingers. And we say, oh, the schools are just doing a terrible job. Look at society around us. It's true. But how much can we do about what other people are doing? Not a whole lot. Who has the greatest influence? It's parents. Parents have a far greater influence than the best teacher in the world. We need good teachers. Praise God for good teachers, but they pale in significance to the influence of a parent. The position of a parent is one of the most responsible on earth, yet it is far too lightly regarded by the majority of the world. The future of the rising generation is in whose hands? In the hands of parents. For in a great measure, they, parents, hold within their control the destiny of their children for time and for eternity. The salvation of the young depends almost wholly upon the training children receive in childhood. Amen. That's the critical period. And so we can look at the world around us and see how bad it's going, but until parents make those decisions in their own homes, we won't be able to change very much. Do what you can do, because it's easy to look at these and say, oh, that's just overwhelming. I can't do all that. That's impossible. Well, maybe it is impossible to do all of it. But you can do some of it. You can go home, you can plant a garden, you can get some physical activity, you can take away some of the media. Step by step, you can work toward this common goal, and you can make a difference in your children's lives. I encourage you, be yourself, be part of a thinking generation, and then make your families part of a thinking generation. It's critical in the last days. Bow your heads with me. Father in heaven, thank you. You've given us wisdom. You've given us insight into the developing mind. We can now see what is important. And Lord, I just want to lift up each family, each parent here. Give them wisdom in applying these things. Help them to resist Satan's attacks on their families, to do what is right for their children, to raise them for your kingdom. For it's in Jesus' name I ask. Amen. Amen.